We're going to start by talking about what VILT is and why you would use it. We'll also talk about how to replicate elements of an ILT in a VILT environment. We'll get into the business case for VILT. What's the value of it? And then last, of course, we're going to have time for Q&A. So let's get started with the very first element. What is VILT and why would you use it? So here you can see a really interesting quote that we came across. So the old school way of training, ILT or instructor-led, is really still the predominant method across the board. So maybe not at very specific organizations, but across the board, it is still the predominant method. So you can see that referenced in this quote. So 46% of training hours were delivered by a stand and deliver instructor in a classroom setting. And that's down just a teeny bit from 47%. So that's still a predominant delivery method at most organizations, and it's something to consider. So, but keeping this in mind, we know most organizations can't rely on this as the only method because it's costly. We all understand that. So it's costly from a dollars as well as from a time standpoint. So let's just take a step to the side and clearly define what we're talking about here in relation to ILT and VILT. So you can see I have some doing quote fingers, definitions, if you will, for the two delivery methods. And they're the same, except we have one distinction, one word distinction there, which is virtual. But instructor-led training is the practice of face-to-face training and learning material between an instructor and the learners, either individuals or groups. So the same thing for VILT, except we're taking that face-to-face and putting a virtual wrapper around it. So I do want to point out that right now, what you're experiencing, this is not a VILT session. This is a webinar. And because of the lower interactivity between myself and you, we have a webinar. If there was more interactivity, more discussion, some other things going on where the participants were speaking more, we could start to question whether it was a VILT. But right now, in its current state, it is a webinar. The technical definition of virtual, according to dictionary.com, is temporarily simulated or extended by computer software. We can attach that to what we're talking about in relation to virtual training. So let's talk about why VILT. Why? Why should organizations select this as their delivery method? First and foremost, as I'm sure you understand, it connects a dispersed workforce. So more and more organizations are geographically dispersed, and they can take advantage of VILT delivery to connect their people. And so that connection can happen in different ways. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but having distance between their people, VILT, shortens that distance, connects them. And I would like to point out that distances don't have to be really lengthy, dramatic. They don't need to be across countries or in different parts of the globe. Even distances of several hours for an organization's people, VILT can take advantage and provide that connection opportunity. So all of that still happens. Second, there's ways to replicate dynamics of an ILT in VILT. If you could replicate an ILT experience in VILT, you can save some money and save some time. Why wouldn't you choose VILT? Third, obviously savings. So we just mentioned that. We just talked about savings, but there's financial savings and time savings, and there's other ways that VILT brings value to what we do. And lastly, VILT actually expands the capabilities of the L&D team. So it's another tool that L&D can add to their toolbox. More tools create more opportunities for L&D to demonstrate and provide value to the organization as a whole. So we're going to go ahead and get into some details on how or what areas of ILT can be replicated in a VILT environment. There are three elements that I've pulled up to the surface in relation to what can be replicated. But before I get into them, what I'd like to be really clear about and state simply is just because you're using a virtual platform does not make your session a VILT. It's the design of the content and the design of the learning will make it VILT. So the platform is great. It's a tool. It's technology in our tool belt. but it isn't the reason something is a VILT. The same goes true for if you're holding a meeting and using PowerPoint slides, that does not make that meeting a training session. So we want to keep that in mind and how we want to make the VILT session as robust as we can so we really can leverage the VILT moment. What I like to think of VILT is a really interactive session where the facilitator is having discussions with the participants. Participants are sharing and engaged in activities. They're working in small groups. There's different kinds of engagement that are happening throughout the session. So it isn't just a one-directional monologue. It is an engagement between the participants and the facilitator. So similar to ILT, except that you have that span of space and time and you're using technology to deliver the message. Okay, so our first one that we're going to talk about is dialogue and conversation. So you can see how that connects learners to each other and the facilitator. We're also going to talk about interactions, how activities can draw learners and enhance engagement. And we're also going to talk about participation and how that builds value and creates connecting paths. So our first area that we'll talk about is dialogue and conversation and how it's going to happen across the virtual lines. During face-to-face sessions, facilitators can create those conversations that weave throughout the training segment. Sometimes relatively simple to do that. Sometimes it's a little bit more challenging. But participants can also engage in their own conversations with each other. So sometimes even while the facilitator is speaking, right? So how can those conversations, the productive ones, be replicated in a VILT environment? So it's important for the facilitator to initiate and create the dialogue by welcoming the participants right when they join. You're being the good hostess, you're welcoming them in, you're engaging them right off the bat. And it's just simple like questions. How are you? How's the weather? Where are you, what's going on where you're located with the weather? Or what sports-related reference that is familiar at the time, or a new company initiative that is being rolled out can be discussed. So those like questions to start to create dialogue and create that path for future conversations. And as those connections are happening, the facilitator can pull in other participants as they join or along the way into that conversation by pointing to them directly. So a dialogue is happening between the facilitator and another participant, and the facilitator can reach out to a third participant and say, so, Sam, what do you think of that? Or whatever kind of question that's pointed directly to that next participant. That all can happen, and you can, just like you would in a room face-to-face, you can create those conversations and connect people. If that virtual platform that you're using has a chat feature, use that, and you want to encourage participants to use that as well. They can send messages directly to the facilitator, they can send messages to the entire group, they can send messages directly to each other as individuals. So you have a lot of opportunity in relation to the chat or question box. I would like to add, this is where facilitators need to let go of a little bit of control. So sometimes in the ILT format, we can kind of see everything that's going on. We can get a sense of things by looking and seeing people and how they're interacting and how they're sitting. And in a VILT session, you don't necessarily have that ability. So you need to let go of the control a little bit and allow some of those dialogues to happen. Now, I've been conducting virtual sessions for quite some time, and my experience has been that if you treat your participants like adults, they will act like adults. And if you allow those dialogues to happen, you'll get robust dialogue amongst your participants. If by the chance that a dialogue does go off to a place that may not be directed or connected to the content, typically the participants will police each other, and they will kind of rein each other in. So allow them to have a little bit more control, release the grip a little bit, and you can have a really robust dialogue. Another thing I'd like to add is, in related to this dialogue and starting to create these connecting paths, if you have the ability to reach out to your participants ahead of time, before the session, I highly recommend that. I'm a firm believer that every single training program should have a communications plan wrapped around it that helps to build foundation for what the training plan is about. It creates excitement. It sets the stage. There's so many values for that. So if you can reach out to your participants ahead of time, it's a great add-on. And it doesn't have to be a complicated communication plan. It can be a very simple email, just saying, this is what's coming. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the virtual session. If the organization has an intranet or an opportunity or location where discussions can happen, a discussion board or online board, the facilitator can also use that as an avenue to start to create connections before that session begins. I highly recommend it if you have that ability. So these are just some early steps in creating dialogues that will lead to reinforcing connections between those participants. So if the facilitator delivers an activity a little bit later in the session, and that activity requires some small group participation, the learners have already started to work together and engage with each other. So getting into those activities isn't as challenging. They're primed and they're ready to go. So in ILT sessions, activities allow those learners to practice and reinforce the learning of content recently presented, and they can do team building and a whole bunch of other things. You can replicate this. It's not exactly the same, but you can replicate it in VILT sessions. Many ILT activities can be reformatted or redesigned for a virtual format. And so when I design training, I'm looking at the content and what the audience needs and the other dynamics to better define and help the learner connect to the content to eventually reach the goal identified by the business. So the delivery method on how to do that is just the pathway. So there's ways to take those ILT elements and transform them for a virtual platform. So in relation to small group activities where participants can go off to a separate area and work together, you can do this virtually. And you can do this in a low-tech virtual way. You don't necessarily need the full-blown virtual platform. So you can assign your group activity. You have your teams assigned as well, that everybody knows who's working with whom and what they're supposed to be working on. And you can give your participants empowerment for handling the task on their own, and that's cloaked with accountability because you'll be checking in on them in other virtual capacities, email, text, whatever it may be. Once the participants are off doing their activities, you'll let them know that they have X amount of minutes, just like you would in an ILT session. You'll give them the boundaries. They have X amount of minutes to work on whatever. They go off in their own group, work on their project. They can have a conference call with the group. They can do it by email. They can do it by video chat, by instant message, whatever platforms are available through the organization. And then when it's time for them to come back, they report back into the VILT session at the scheduled time. And I like to take that kind of activity and then have someone from each team obviously share their learnings or use their learnings as the debrief and the opportunity to connect everybody back together. So small group activity done virtually. Just a little shift there. Now keep in mind, depending on how long your virtual sessions are, your participants still need breaks. So you want to keep that in mind. You don't want to run a 3-hour VILT without any breaks. You have to give them breaks. So plan that into your sessions as needed. Now, I like to take breaks and attach them to activities. So the example that I just described, that small group virtual activity, you can say that they have 20 minutes for the activity, and you're going to tack in your 5 to 10 or whatever the right number is for a break. So they can take their break before, take it after, whatever works for the team, but they complete their activity, they can get their break time in, and then they report back to the session. So when designing for a VILT, think of how the activity can be executed using the virtual platform, and think outside the box. So the facilitator may not be able to hand deliver a worksheet to be completed, but that worksheet can be shared electronically. Several platforms have the ability for file sharing. You can also send it via email ahead of the session, or you can post it in your discussion board channel if the organization has that. There's lots of ways to share things electronically outside of the typical handing it out that you would do in an ILT. So the facilitator may not be able to see what is happening in the small groups, but that facilitator can check in with those groups in the breakout rooms if that's used via chat, instant message, email, even text. So it's just shifting our thinking from the ILT into the virtual delivery platform. Okay, so now we're going to talk about participation. So with participation, it's important, obviously, in ILT sessions. So the same holds true for a VILT. And this goes back to that question that was shared in our question box a little bit earlier. This is what really makes a VILT, the participation. So sometimes facilitators can spend a little bit too much time in lecture. They want to keep that in mind, but I like to take lecture and turn it around and turn it on to my participants and have them lecture to each other. So I'm sure you're familiar with the jigsaw activity where each team goes off and learns something and comes back and then shares their learning. So then the whole group can learn about all the things that are necessary. So participants can share insights, experience. Obviously, they can ask questions. Others might want to ask as well, starting a discussion, encouraging others. So if you have the ability to allow your participants to really be vocal, so to speak, in the VILT session, I encourage that. So you can obviously use the audio depending on the size of your session, but the chat feature, the question box, is also a great way to collect their information and share it amongst the wall. Passing presenter rights to your participants is also a great way to get them involved and get them engaged in what's going to happen. And lastly, when you're calling on participants, be sure to call on them by name. Don't just toss out a blanket question. Be pointed with it. Sam, tell me more about bullet 1. And that way, Sam is charged to step up and share his experience. So be direct with your questions and make sure that you're calling on them by name to ensure that they are going to step up and participate in that group. So far, we've talked about a lot of things, but one thing I do want to point out is that I've used the word participant often. And I'd like to just draw that connection for you, that participant, using that word, starts to automatically create a participatory tone for the session versus attendee, which is much more passive. Something to keep in mind as you're developing and designing your VILT sessions. So let's talk about the business case for VILT. What are the values? What's the good stuff within VILT that will help you create a business case for it? So VILT does have several layers of savings or value for organizations, and you can see the 3 of them here. We have financial savings, support and reinforcement of the people, enhancement of the knowledge management. So 3 key areas. We're going to start with the most obvious one, our financial savings. So with what we know about VILT so far, as a delivery platform, we can easily understand how virtual sessions can reduce costs. So you can reduce costs in the obvious ways. Seat time. So the time that your participants are not at their desks, you can save that time because you can shorten the travel time and things like that. Printed materials. Very often materials are presented in a virtual way, so you have a huge savings there. Rental facilities. There are many organizations that spend a good amount of money on a rental facility for ILT sessions. So you can lower that cost, reduce it even by doing VILT. And then I did mention the travel time for participants and those travel costs because the travel is not needed. So here's a little nugget and related to innovative savings that comes from VILT. You can easily enhance and scale up your training programs and curriculums by adding VILT to existing programs. So I like to think of training as chunks of elements or chunks of puzzle pieces, so to speak, and they can connect back together, and you can connect them back in different ways. So enhancing a large-scale training initiative, you can do that by blending other delivery methods, VILT, some micro-learning, other things like that, and using the VILT as a connection point. Connects phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 and brings the learner down the path. I've talked about using an internet portal and the discussion boards a couple times already, but think of the VILT segment as a larger part of the training initiative, which is what I just described. So it can be a series of VILT sessions that build onto previous trainings to help prepare participants for an upcoming training. And to bridge those sessions together and learnings together, if you have the opportunity in the platform at your organization, you can create a portal specifically for that training initiative or that training group and allow that to double as a resource center and community builder for participants. There's a lot of value in this, so if you have that capability, I encourage you to test it out. But dialogues can be happening before the training starts. The facilitator can tap into those dialogues to build connections. The facilitator can also see where there might be common questions amongst the participants that they need to make sure that they address in the session. But you can also use it to share resources, to prep the learners, to get them ready and engaged for being the right participant in that VILT session. So whether it's videos or articles or white papers or worksheets, things like that, pre-work can definitely build on that. And you can use that VILT as that connecting point to explain things and move the learner and the participants down the path. So now let's talk about the support and reinforcement of the organization's people and how VILT can do that. So VILT definitely provides autonomy for the people in relation to their learnings. They have a little bit more control in certain elements, and you can definitely take advantage of that. And so when those learners have more control, you can use the blended format, such as what I've been describing with the VILT and some micro-learning and things like that. Your learners can have some control, so to speak, on what they complete when, where applicable, and then they can have that autonomy. And while reinforcing this, VILT sessions also connect the organization's workforce. So that's obvious. We've talked about that already and how it connects people across very far distances or even shorter distances. But that connection and establishing those connections can be really, really beneficial, especially if you don't have the opportunity to bring your people together on a regular basis, like face-to-face together. So when those groups are separated by distance, sometimes those connections are challenging because of the virtual or the distance element. And this can even happen between departments. So you can really use VILT as a way to create those connections and get people to working together and getting used to working together across departments and working with each other. VILT even establishes collaboration. So when sessions engage participants in those group activities, you're getting that collaborative team building element occurring, and all of that really is enhancing. So you're kind of training them on how to work together across distances when you're engaging in VILT and when you're doing some of those small group activities that we talked about a little bit earlier. So this sets the stage and opens doors for how the teams and people will work across those distances and outside of the standard VILT format. So you're kind of setting the stage, prepping them for those interactions, and you can go beyond. During a VILT session, what I encourage you to do is, if you have the ability, is to share some personal elements or have them share personal elements about themselves. So there's a variety of ways to do this. They can share pictures of themselves, pictures of their pets, of their kids. What we do here at Cavio is we share a picture of our office, of our workspace. So we all work virtually, and then we get the opportunity by doing that, get to see how each other works within their office. And so it starts to make connections and build that framework for collaboration and the personal element that sometimes gets lost because of the VILT platform when it isn't being engaged. I also like to use a map at the beginning of some sessions, especially when my participants are really geographically dispersed across wide spans of space. And I'll throw a map up on the slide and have each participant annotate where they're located. And you can start to see where everyone is located across the globe, and it starts to create interesting connections for that realization of how you are all working together even across those spans. So you can use this as an icebreaker, any other kind of interaction. Maybe it's a great way to start up again after a break to pull the participants in. So similar to what I did at the beginning with the favorite candy, it could be as simple as that. It doesn't have to be very complicated. And our last one is enhancing knowledge management. So this is kind of a sneaky one, but I think it's really critical and really important for us to keep this in mind. So knowledge management is defined as the efficient handling of information and resources within an organization. So training is a big part of knowledge management, and we all know that the knowledge management can quickly and easily get out of control when we aren't watching over it. So VILT can help to enhance this. One organization and the people within it contain mounds and mounds of information related to processes, marketing, operations, training, whatever it may be. When L&D can leverage VILT, they can build into the existing knowledge management using that VILT. And that VILT can also create those connections between the knowledge management areas. So if you kind of think of knowledge management as the library, so to speak, of all the stuff, the information related to the organization. And L&D can use VILT to connect the dots between those library books or library resources within that big span of knowledge management. The cool part of VILT is the recording feature. And most VILT platforms have this ability, and every VILT session should be recorded, in my opinion. Whether it's a really good one or just an average one, there's something of value within that session. And you can definitely take advantage of those recorded sessions and use them to enhance other training programs. So when those recorded sessions are stored in an accessible location, which is part of the knowledge repository, participants can access them again at a later date, and they can take advantage of that knowledge as a refresher, or maybe they missed the session and they need to catch up, whatever it may be, but providing that information back out to your organization is really beneficial. So here's a tip. What I was just alluding to, one of the great benefits of a recorded session is having that information captured and being able to use it again in a different format. So you can slice and dice those recorded sessions and pull out the nugget of information that relates to a new training initiative in just that little segment. You can slice and dice it, the video or just the audio, and you can create these standalone training items that can be plug and played into different training initiatives. So start to think about your VILT sessions as this encyclopedia of this information, and you want to pull out that one nugget of information to then therefore use it in a future training initiative. So there's a lot of different things that can happen with that. VILT can be used as the initial steps in an onboarding plan. You can also use it to create a cohort with your participants who will go through a longer training initiative altogether. So here's some other response. So we've used it with global training for rolling out standardized process. That's great. You can also use VILT. I've used it as a virtual conference. Our participants did not have the ability to come together one year. So instead of canceling the conference, which is a really valid and important milestone each year, we held it virtually. And we got some great feedback and responses. And we did a lot of fun, playful things throughout the conference. But we had scheduled sessions and people dialed in just as they would attend a conference. And it created some good bonding, even though we were across wide distances. So here is a summary of what we've discussed so far. So it does have, VILT has a solid business case for implementation for L&D departments. So as we talked early on, it can replicate those elements of VILT: dialogue, conversation, interaction, participation. And then it provides those 3 layers of value: financial savings, support and reinforcement of the people at the organization, and then enhancing the knowledge management. So before we kind of wrap things up, I do want to provide some quick pointers for designing and delivering on a VILT platform. These are things that I've learned the hard way along the way, but I wanted to share with you. The first one, as I mentioned early on, let go of having the entire control. You'll be a better facilitator when you allow those discussions and dialogues to happen. If you can leverage the help of a producer to help with the technical elements of your VILT session, I recommend that. I also recommend adding a start recording slide to remind yourself to record. If I don't have that slide and I need to record, I will forget. And then when you're designing for VILT, think outside the box, try new things. Depending on the culture of your organization, if you can test things out in a pilot format, you can start to explore and see what your participants are willing to do within that VILT session. And you can start to replicate more and more and more of those VILT elements in the virtual session. And lastly, practice over and over and over. Practice, practice, practice. Be really comfortable with your content and be comfortable with the platform so you know what to click and where to go, and you're using the right terms for what the different elements are.
So the first question I have here for you, Joey, is what happens if people don't respond to questions?
That's a good one, because it happens. My take on that, and from my experience, is to be okay with silence for a little bit. Sometimes delay in technology, but sometimes people just need to muster up a little strength to respond to the question. So to be okay with silence for a little bit and allow them to speak up, and to, again, to release the control a little bit and allow them to step in. If no one does respond after a good amount of time, then it's totally fine and acceptable to call on someone specifically and have them answer the question. And then hopefully those initial conversations and the pathways that you've done at the beginning will start to create more of a camaraderie or more interaction where people won't be as silent in your audience.
The next one we have here is, how do you manage the technology issues that occur while conducting the session?
So depending on if you can use a producer, I highly recommend it if you can. If you have over 50 to 75 and up in your session, using a producer is really, really helpful. If not, what I would do is to provide information early on before the session starts in relation to technical support, testing out their technology before the session starts, making sure that they can access the link, they can open up the webinar platform, they're familiar with it. Those are really helpful things to do before your session even starts. And those can go in those early communications that we talked about earlier. But what if something does occur and you don't have a producer, what you can do is direct that participant to that technical information you shared earlier and then go back and focus on delivering your content. So it's a tough one because you don't want to leave people high and dry, but you do have a classroom, a virtual classroom of participants that you need to provide attention to. So providing information ahead of time, making sure that they're equipped to handle their technical issues offline, that's a helpful way to manage that if you can't leverage a producer.
And what is one piece of advice you would give to someone doing VILT training for the first time?
First, know the technology as best as you can. I always like to practice and poke around at the technology to make sure you're familiar with what happens when you click what and how you should do things the correct way. So even if you can find a buddy that just logs in as an attendee, and so you can see and experience things from different capacities. I know people that do virtual sessions on a regular basis, and they have a whole setup. They have like 2 or 3 monitors. One monitor that shows just what the participant sees, another monitor that shows what they see, and then another monitor that has maybe content on it. And they have a whole setup created for that. If you do VILT sessions on a regular basis, I recommend that. Just like you would be really prepared and have all the right tools when you're doing an ILT, you want to do the same honor for your VILT sessions. And then, like I had said, practice in the technology platform as much as you can. Get familiar with it.
What do you like best about VILT?
I like it because it's flexible. It provides additional opportunities for learners. So a lot of what we covered today, but there's so much you can do. And I think once we kind of take the boundaries off of what we think VILT is, we start to expand our capabilities and our opportunities with it. The cool thing about VILT, like I had shared earlier, is it starts to become a glue to connect the pieces in your blended programs. And it's a great way to allow your learners to go off, complete some e-learning, watch a video, work on a case study. You bring them back together in a VILT session, you talk about what they learned so far, and then you go send them off to do the next level of learning. So it's a great way to make those connections, and it can really be engaging. It really can pull people in, and you can have great discussions even though you're across those virtual guidelines.
What are the most popular and widely used VILT platforms?
Adobe Connect is a really familiar one, being used a lot today. There's also WebEx, and WebEx has several different, whether it's a training platform or just a meeting platform, and a lot of them do that. GoToMeeting, Citrix's GoToMeeting and GoToWebinar is like that as well. And so some of it depends on how many attendees do you expect on a regular basis. But the platforms are there for that. Now, I know people that have been leveraging low-tech tools for VILT. So it isn't all bells and whistles, but you know, your organization may have an instant message platform such as Link or Skype. There's other opportunities out there like Google Hangouts that you could use. And if your organization leverages the Google platform, you could use Google Docs, which is a really cool tool where you can be editing a document on the fly. The entire, you know, several participants can be in one document editing it on the fly. It's a really cool tool to use to see engagement across a virtual span. So there's a whole bunch out there, and my recommendation when you're looking at the different platforms is to really truly know what it is you need in that virtual platform and what your organization needs. Sometimes, just like with the smartphone, we go and we get the newest version, and we're really only using the phone to answer email and check Facebook. Get what you need, but you don't necessarily have to go above and beyond that. So keep that in mind as well.